Hi folks, FloridaMan here. Today I'm bringing you an after-action report on a game that I did not play in, but rather GM'd. This game begins 8 months ago, in early March 2021. The game was played on VDiplomacy, on the largest scale variant map we've ever covered on this channel, with well over 150 centers. The map was recommended by one of the players, going under the username Lex Luthor, who explained that he had helped develop the variant years ago. A number of solid players I've played with before, and supporters of the channel, took part in this game, which made it an interesting game that I was enthusiastic about observing. A Fluffy Fruit played as Britain, but was soon replaced by Rex. Animals CS played as France, Cheez-It played as Holland, Flaming Eyeball played as Prussia, Bona Together played as Austria, Melior played as Russia, Yoda Man King played as Turkey, Oxmeister played as China, Ulster played as Japan, Official played as USA, Lex Luthor played as the Confederate States of America, which will henceforth be called the CSA, Christina Feggi played as Mexico, and Premier Garfield played as Brazil. So as you can see, there were a lot of players in this game who are connected to the FloridaMan Diplomacy community in one way or another, and I was pleased to see what would happen, bringing all these people together. The map is what you see now, and as you can probably tell, this is not a balanced map at all. Britain begins with the most centers, with dots all over the map, and France and Holland likewise have pretty substantial overseas empires. Russia is an absolutely massive land power with 10 units, and below it is France with just 6 centers, and floating off their coast, Japan starts with only 4. And all of these powers are competing for the same end goal, the same number of centers, so the only balance that exists is the balance that the players impose, and the balance that the world's map naturally has in real life, which is to say no balance at all. Unbalanced maps can be fascinating though, so we'll see how this plays out, and whether being really large at the beginning is a massive advantage, or just makes you a massive target. The only power that kept really consistent notes on the game throughout most of the runtime was Britain, so this after-action report will be biased toward the British perspective. However, there will be interjections from other powers' perspectives, including France, Brazil, Russia, China, and Holland. Also, I'm not very good at reading the maps on VDiplomacy, and the arrows just confuse me rather than clarifying anything, so I will probably make a number of mistakes. You can feel free to highlight those in the comments, as if people need permission. In spring 1861, Britain communicated meaningfully with the USA, CSA, France, Russia, and Turkey. USA seemed to have some sort of very early beef with Russia that might not have been related to this game. CSA seemed to want British help in the Americas, and Britain found him fairly convincing and liked his proposed split of the United States. France seemed to be intimidated by Britain, and gave off the impression that he'd probably stab Britain within a couple of years of the start. Russia gave off a much more trustworthy vibe, and Turkey likewise seemed reliable, although long-term, Britain noted that he might be a threat if the Mediterranean was settled. France had 1861 reflections too. He thought the British and the Dutch seemed like astute, responsive players, and although he initially planned to try and set them against each other, he ultimately determined to try to form a triple with them and create conflict between them later. France identified his early priority as growing in the Americas and Africa, which would allow him to expand and link his European holdings and colonies together into a transatlantic empire. He considered the big natural threat to this plan to be Brazil, and he determined, therefore, to eliminate Brazil early and secure control of the mid-Atlantic, using his alliance with Holland to make this happen. His next target would be China, who he felt could kick him out of Asia. He had an alliance cooked up with Russia and Japan to get China as a countermeasure for that. He analogized his general thinking in this game as similar to the way he'd play Germany on the classic map, trying to make alliances that would eliminate France and Russia. His approach was to create multiple player alliances and gradually whittle down the powers that he perceived as his threats. He expected his mid-game threats here to be Holland, Britain, and possibly Japan, and his long-term natural allies to be Turkey and Russia. In North America, France was less sure what he wanted to see, but his intuition was that he was rooting for Mexico and the USA rather than the CSA. Meanwhile, Holland's immediate observation upon receiving that country assignment was that Holland was weak in Europe and strong in the Far East, and therefore the Dutch plan was to stay small in Europe and help out France and Britain while getting so large in East Asia that any attack would be fruitless. Although aware of the possibility of a French-British fight in the future, Holland claimed to be indifferent to the idea. Holland noted that Britain was clearly trying to contain Dutch units in their early negotiations, while France was a very aggressive player who wanted to try and attack someone as early as possible, and Holland had to decline an opening attack on Great Britain. Prussia was very ambitious and ruffled Dutch feathers a bit by basically saying he would grab all the grabbable neutral dots. Ultimately, however, Holland felt that he was able to successfully negotiate for Denmark. The first thing Russia noted in his reflections is that he doesn't consider himself very good at the game, he's rusty, and he was therefore likely to avoid bold plays, at least until the mid-game. He was happy to draw Russia, a nation he doesn't get to play too often on the larger scale maps. Being the second largest power while also having all of his centers in one place, unlike the colonial empires, seemed to him like a massive amount of power to wield. In terms of plans, he hoped to apply a strategy that had helped him numerous times. Lie low year one. The longer he could wait without upsetting anyone, the better. Letting other nations fight first would hopefully give him the negotiating advantage. To start, St. Pete could grab Sweden guaranteed, moving through Finland so as to keep Prussia happy and also correcting Finland's color to Russian purple instead of neutral. The Russo-Prussian border looked like an absolute mess, but he determined he could afford to keep Warsaw where it was. Prussia had informed him of plans to take Bavaria, Stuttgart, Kiel, and Denmark year one, which seemed mighty ambitious of them, but did not bother Russia. The border with Austria also looked complicated. Without the luxury of Ukraine space to funnel armies through, taking Romania could be a challenge, although happily Austria seemed to be heading west instead of east. With Turkey, Russia observed that the two of them had 2 units sitting next to 3 important spaces: Romania and Baku, supply centers, and the Black Sea, which was bordered by 7 supply centers. What Russia hoped to agree on through negotiations with Turkey was a bounce in the Black Sea, Russian control of Baku, and Turkey doing what he'd like with the unit in Sofia. Looking to Asia, Russia observed an interesting triangle between himself, China, and Japan. Japan had a severe lack of armies, China had a severe lack of fleets, and Russia would have to fight to stay alive there. He and China had conferred on how to split the neutrals between them, including Russia giving up Port Arthur and sailing his poor lost fleet into Korea. Russia thought China could get far more out of Japan attacking him than Japan himself would, which might help Russia nudge Japan into moving south and east where his real neutral access was. Finally, on the other side of the world, Russia found Alaska to be a subtle but significant boost to Russia's big stick power, giving him fleet leverage on Japan and America, as well as center access and opportunities with Britain and Canada. Russia identified the relationship he had with Britain as perhaps the best of all he had so far. They had agreed on splitting neutrals without trouble, and had already drafted ideas for the future, including a Treaty of Tordesillas-like split of Europe and North America. Russia hoped to get 6 builds the first year, from Sweden, one of Romania or Baku, Khabarovsk, Tehran, Sakhalin, Yukon, and Seoul, while losing Port Arthur. From the Chinese perspective, his opening negotiations went well. He said the exception was France, who seemed to be pursuing an aggressive line on the neutrals in Thailand. Russia proposed an alliance from the get-go, China said, which he found to be of interest, but Japan and Great Britain were also very chatty and open to discussions. From Brazil's perspective, he first worked to establish good relations with Mexico, Britain, Holland, and France. He negotiated alliances with France and Britain, and peace with Holland. When spring orders processed, Britain and CSA both moved in a way that was hostile to the US, and there were several bounces because the USA clashed with them. Mexico moved in a way that was neutral to both sides, just trying to grab neutral centers in Central America and the Caribbean. Brazil was basically all alone in South America, so Brazilian expansion there initially looked pretty unstoppable, although there were a couple of French and Dutch units there that looked like they were trying to thwart Brazil. Brazil noted that he stabbed Britain with his moves in the spring by moving toward the Falklands, and at the same time France violated a DMZ that Brazil had agreed on with him. Over in Eurasia, Russia expanded in all directions, grabbing lots of neutrals in Central Asia, positioning to enter the fight for Scandinavia, and bouncing with Turkey in the Black Sea. Some things never change, eh? Russia and China looked to be grappling over the Korean Peninsula, while Japan was preparing to go island-hopping in the Pacific, which also feels familiar. The remarkable quality to this map, to interject, is that much of the structure of it seems organized so as to incentivize real quasi-historical events to happen. Japan really did a lot in actual history to conquer Pacific islands. Russia and China, along with Japan, grappled for influence over Korea, which is something you're going to see a lot of on this map. The Russian player, looking over the spring results, felt that things were going as planned, and that he had guaranteed 6 builds already. After spring, he debated whether to possibly move his army in Warsaw to Prussia or Silesia. Prussia, to Russia's surprise, actually had the chance to double in size in year 1. It seemed he and Austria worked out a deal for him to get Bavaria, and Russia wasn't sure whether Holland would bounce Denmark or defend against a possible British attack from the North Sea. If Russia took Prussia and Holland bounced Denmark, Prussia could only build 2 units, which would both be forced to be armies. Additionally, Britain, who Russia said was in support of this plan, and Russia would together have 2 units on Denmark, Sweden and Norway. Russia claimed that France was also quite worried about the possibility of an Austro-Prussian alliance. The only drawback to the plan, Russia noticed, was if the Turks attacked him. Having taken a lot of centers around them, Russia thought he could easily form a good force to fight them in 1862. That wasn't what Russia particularly wanted to do, but he was concerned that if Turkey was worried about it enough, they might not bounce Black Sea and move into Sevastopol. Russia had prepared for this possibility by moving Moscow to Sevastopol, but fighting 2 neighbors that are so near each other, especially factoring in whose side Austria was likely to be on, seemed like a disaster waiting to happen. His hope was that he believed the Turks had other problems to worry about, and even if he did attack Russia, since Russia was prepared to keep him from making gains, Russia thought he would be able to talk him into reversing course. Russia identified Alaska as safe as well, because Great Britain seemed to still want his friendship. In Europe, Prussia and Austria clashed over Bavaria, which was again reflective of the real grappling for influence in Germany in the 19th century. France and Austria were both trying to absorb pieces of Italy, and in Africa, Turkey was freely absorbing territory in northwestern Africa, Holland was deepening its influence in southern Africa, and France had an automatic dominance in West Africa. The creators of this map did not include any African-based nations in the game, which is somewhat fair because it's historically accurate to this time period. However, it did reduce Africa to just being a free-for-all region with dots for everyone who was lucky enough to draw a country with a presence in the region, and it reduced the balance of the map a little bit more. In fall 1861, British diplomacy was as follows. He found Japan pleasant, and he wanted to direct Japan at Holland to get them off Britain's back. Japan was apparently unhappy with France for some reason. China claimed to be friendly with Russia and Japan, and he was also unhappy with France. He warned Britain that France and Holland were allying against him, which was something Britain had already suspected. Holland claimed the reason why he was in the Oceania region was to go and hit Japan and China. France wanted to go after China and asked Britain to get Japan on board. In Europe, Britain found that Prussia was very ambitious, hoping to double in size in the first year. Austria was hostile to Prussia. France demanded Spain because he wanted the Mediterranean to be a sphere of influence. Turkey said he was going for the Mediterranean, which Britain was pleased about, because it would conflict with France. In North America, USA and CSA were both trying to influence Britain to help them. He still hadn't heard anything from Mexico at all. Overall, Britain's strongest statement on this season was his conviction that France did not really want an alliance and would stab him as soon as possible. According to Brazil, he managed to get Britain to forgive his bungled attempt to take the Falklands, while France excused his violation of their DMZ by claiming miscommunication. Russia's reflections going into fall were that it was a toss-up whether Great Britain would betray him or not. Russia hoped his moves would reflect that the both of them could succeed if they worked together, and that Russia would have a strong defense if attacked. He said he would be keeping the minimum troops in Asia to secure his border if need be, and moving quite a few into Europe, to face his most dangerous fronts. If Great Britain worked with him, he expected he'd have the advantage over Prussia, taking naval control and threatening Silesia. He was less worried about the possibility of a stab from Austria or Turkey, but he noted he was keeping spare armies to hold a line if they attacked him. The same applied to China and Japan. In Alaska, Russia planned non-threatening moves against Great Britain, calculating that since they had the Americans to worry about there, they probably wouldn't go all out against him. Russia decided he'd bounce France in Hawaii, because although he and France had several opportunities to work together, he had found France incredibly hostile in communications, and so he was resolved to move against him. According to French reflections, he was hoping to steer Britain and Holland into a conflict with each other while remaining relatively neutral, so it seems Britain had the right read on France. France was hoping to continue getting both Britain's and Holland's help in Europe and Asia while he did this, while he deployed his own forces for a big attack on Brazil, since he didn't expect to have a better opportunity later. France decided to forego some of the neutrals he could acquire to make this big push, because he thought the dividends of the conquest of South America and West Africa would be huge. France had a plan to get Japan to let him into MHL in exchange for helping him take Hawaii, even though France knew Russia was also hoping for Hawaii. He said his original plan in Asia was for Japan and Russia to work together against China, but with Russia making odd choices, his next choice was China and Japan working against Russia. Regardless, France considered Japan to be his natural ally, due to compatible long-term goals and directions of expansion. France noted that he was glad that Europe was settling into two competing coalitions: Austria, Prussia, and Britain against Russia, Turkey, and Holland. He thought that would allow him to use most of his builds elsewhere and not do much in Europe. And in fall 1861, France really went for it in South America, snagging a Brazilian home center even as Brazil took over most of the rest of the continent. Holland and Mexico both established footholds in South America as well, which seemed to set the stage for a big conflict between the four of them, with Brazil's territory likely forming the battleground. From Brazil's perspective, fall moves were pretty disastrous, with Britain taking the coast of Argentina and France taking one of Brazil's home centers. In North America, CSA and USA continued struggling, with neither one really gaining from it yet. Only Britain, Mexico, and Russia received net growth from North America this year, and I'm sure the two halves of the American Civil War did not find the situation amusing. In Asia, the trends noted in spring basically continued, with a struggle between Russia, China, and Japan over Korea, and with Japan capturing two Pacific islands. France and Holland worked together to preserve and extend their holdings in southern Asia, and coexisted to the same purpose in Africa. Turkey and Russia again bounced in Black Sea, and Turkey clashed with Austria in Eastern Europe. But overall, Turkey developed a solid hold over most of the Middle East this year, as well as connected parts of North Africa. Austria had the largest empire in continental Europe this year, which wasn't saying much because Austria was one of the only European powers with no holdings outside of Europe. Prussia ultimately did not let Holland have Denmark, and although Holland wanted Denmark, his ally Great Britain supported Prussia in. Britain apparently explained it as a miscommunication, but Holland made clear that explanation had no ring of credibility and gave Britain an ultimatum. Any attack on Helgoland would make it possible to take Holland itself, and therefore any such action would be treated as a breach of their alliance. Looking at this map, without thinking about the reflections from the players too much, my expectation here would be for Britain and France to have an ugly fight soon, because they are the two largest powers, and even after only a single year, they're both too large to easily avoid conflict while satisfying their respective ambitions. As spring 1862 began, a new British player took the place of the old one. In the British chat, the old British player went over the state of British diplomacy. According to Original Recipe Britain, he had good relations at this point with every power except the USA. He characterized his relationship with France as more of a non-aggression pact than an alliance to date, but said they'd talked out some of France's suspicions. France's main reservation, according to Britain, was that he didn't like that Britain seemed to have better positioning and more supply centers than him. France claimed to want to fight Brazil, and to a lesser extent China, now, and Holland in another year or so. Holland claimed that France had said the same thing to him but about Britain. France claimed that his two major allies this game would probably be Japan and Mexico. Britain gave Holland the impression that he'd help him with Prussia and tried to get Holland to fight Japan. Britain reported that he was not super committed on whether he'd actually stab Prussia or not, but noted Prussia was quite unpopular due to perceived greed. Britain noted he'd stabbed USA due to CSA's urging, and USA's poor communications. He identified CSA's priority as killing the USA as quickly as possible and defending against the possibility of a British stab afterward. Britain thought Japan had given him some of the best press of the game, although he noted most of it was complaining about France. The new Britain expressed interest in keeping Russia, Japan, and possibly CSA as long-term allies, eating the USA, using Brazil, China, Holland, and Austria to keep France in check, and possibly using Mexico against CSA in future, since he was a bit worried CSA might try to go north. He thought he might betray Prussia to win Dutch and Russian trust. After some initial communications, Britain ranked the players in his own mind, in order: Japan, China, Prussia, CSA, Austria, Turkey, Holland, Mexico, Brazil, France, and USA. Brazil communicated with the new British player, working to repair relations there. Brazil and Mexico made a deal in the new year to take the Dutch out, and Brazil and CSA began talking about their shared dislike for colonial powers. China observed going into the second year that he was disappointed in Britain's choice to build an army in Delhi, and that Russia had suddenly become uncommunicative, but he didn't mind as he was well positioned to go after Russia. He decided that his main ally was likely to be Japan, and he made plans for a China-Japan alliance with Great Britain as a secondary ally. He prepared to fight France as his first enemy, with a small involvement in the siege of Russia. This, by the way, is when I received Russia's last reflection on the game, which was that he hadn't had the time to do much messaging, and was searching for a replacement, so there wasn't much for him to report on this year. Defensive moves mainly, given that all of his neighbors were now attacking him. He felt he couldn't do this game justice, and he hoped that a new Russian might help the nation's fortunes. As moves played out, the USA's two-front war with Britain and CSA began to take a powerful toll on the Union. CSA walked into New Mexico and supported himself into Chicago and Washington, D.C., while Britain supported himself into New York City and Seattle. Basically, the position of the USA was utterly destroyed in a single season. In South America, Brazil benefited from Britain not attacking them, because with all the Brazilian units focused on defense, Brazil was essentially able to nullify the French and Dutch attacks. In Africa, Holland began to pull ahead of France in a very noticeable way as the frontrunner for control of that continent. In Southeast Asia, Britain and Holland clashed over the island territories that had been under Dutch dominion, with Japan and France seeming to position to grab more neutral supply centers in the midst of the chaos. At the same time, Japan advanced against Russia and Korea, which, not to sound like a broken record, reflects real history. China also advances against Russia, although it would be fair to say China is advancing in all directions at this point, slowly expanding like a snowball rolling downhill. Turkey and Russia continued to clash, wasting both of their forces. At the same time, Russia was clashing with Prussia and Austria was clashing with Turkey. In Europe, Britain helped Prussia take Holland from Holland, breaking any semblance of alliance between Holland and Britain. Britain and Prussia were also working together against Russia. In fall 1862, Brazil continued to make diplomatic progress. Britain passed along intelligence to Brazil about a planned French move to Rio de Janeiro, and Brazil tried to also pull Holland into an anti-French coalition, although with no tangible result. When all orders processed, the nails continued to be hammered into USA's coffin, with CSA supporting Mexico into San Francisco, and USA only holding out in Oregon with a last army. To the south, Brazil and France traded centers, and Brazil got slightly bigger thanks to the acquisition of the last unclaimed neutral on the continent. On the bright side for France, he continued to collect neutrals as well, getting 2 island centers off the coast of the Americas, including Hawaii. In Africa, although it had looked to me like Holland was moving north to establish a bigger hold on Africa beyond the southern tip, France backs Holland down and captures the center that it looked like Holland was going to acquire. Instead, Holland gets a neutral that's closer to the spaces already under Dutch control. Turkey and Britain both penetrate further south on the east coast, with Turkey grabbing Sudan and Britain taking Abyssinia. In Southeast Asia, Britain and Holland struggled inconclusively over their island centers, with both of them growing due to the fact that there were still unclaimed island centers that they were able to get during their fighting. China continued the same pattern of basic success observed in spring. Russia lost ground to China and Japan while gaining ground relative to Turkey. In Europe, it was a story of Russia losing more ground. Other than Prussia and Great Britain moving forward against Russia, it was mostly stagnant on Europe this season. A slight deviation from that general trend was France supporting Holland in retaking Holland. In spring 1863, France and Holland tried to make peace with Britain, but Britain decided to just use that as an opportunity to more successfully attack the both of them. As orders processed, Britain expanded his North American holdings, opening up another front against Russia there. CSA turned all the forces he'd been using to attack USA and invaded Mexico and the Caribbean. A disastrous turn of events for Mexico, who had moved everything south at the same time that CSA came attacking from the north. This season noticeably and meaningfully brings Mexico much closer to death than they were before, from being a healthy-sized power that could have perhaps dominated North America to a power that will likely become food for CSA unless something turns around soon. In South America, Brazil continued to wage defensive war against France and Holland, with very little happening. On the west coast of Africa, France continued to grow essentially unchallenged, while Holland faced continued southern movement from Britain and Turkey, as well as the potential threat that France could at some point decide he wanted more of Africa. In Southeast Asia, there was a lot of movement, but very little happened in the island regions. France lost a little ground to China on the mainland. China's ambitions had grown to a degree that he was now in conflict with most of his neighbors. Japan, France, and Russia would all have benefited at this point if something were to happen to China. Based on the fact that he was expanding in all directions, I predicted that there would be a counterattack against him to knock him down to size pretty soon. Britain's moves reflected the continued effort to destroy Russia on his part, and Britain also stabbed Holland at this point. Holland noted that after suffering the British stab, he had to hope he'd be able to survive by absorbing still unclaimed neutral centers and receiving French support, and that if France turned on him too, it would be the end. In Europe, it's not too much to say that everyone was now attacking France. After this season, Britain provided his impressions of every player. Prussia, good player and good ally, talkative and cooperative. I like him a lot. Turkey, classic Yoda, strong but silent. Seems to be doing a lot of what I say, which is never a bad thing. Possible future target for a Great Britain-Austria coalition. Austria. Good ally, although I'm not quite sure how tactically skilled he is. A possible future ally against Turkey, but for geographical rather than strategic reasons. Holland. Rarely communicates, not tactically fantastic, should be reduced to 0 to 1 builds this turn, so won't be a problem in the future. France. Quite an unpleasant player to deal with, although fortunately he's not the most tactically skilled or diplomatically adept. Still not quite sure why he stabbed, although it won't end well for him. He'll lose his Southeast Asian and European holdings within a year or so. After that, he won't be a problem. China. Really nice guy. He and I seem to largely be on the same page. I'd like to stay long-term allies with him if possible. Maybe even a good ally against Japan in the long run? Japan. A great ally at the moment in the fight against the Dutch. However, sooner or later my fleets are gonna need a direction to go in, and Japan seems to be the natural target. He's also slightly too supply center hungry for my liking, even though I'm being generous to him. CSA. An excellent long-term ally and good player, although I don't particularly like his manner. I do trust him, but I expect him to be ruthless, so I shouldn't let my guard down. USA. Will be dead this turn, and for good reason. Russia. Barely communicates, a long-term enemy for me, and likely an easy one to vanquish. Mexico. Not a great player, but hopefully he'll rely on me for help against the CSA, which I won't provide. Target of my manipulation.